So, I've been watching this discourse surrounding the Red Panda movie unfold since more or less before it hit the theater. And I'm, let's say, disappointed by what it chooses to focus on. I have my critique of the movie, or not the movie itself, but the current trend of Asian stories and immigrant stories in North American popular media, which this movie is a part of. But I feel like I can't get to that part because we're stuck dealing with all this bogus controversy about whether or not the movie is universal or appropriate for children. And that's just like, what? Like, can we stop pretending like people are having issue with this movie because it mentions period, or because it's about girlhood, or because it's cringe? Can we stop honoring these red herrings and just call the controversies for the sparkling anti-Asian racism that it is? Like, are we seriously gonna let people pretend to be pearl clutching at teenage girls having boy crushes and doodling hearts in their notebooks, and not because this particular girl doodles it in Japanese anime style, which Western audience inherently consider more perverse? What are we doing? Can we just say the quiet parts out loud? They are not that slick. You think the people crying about the rituals being demonic and appalling say the same things about the witchcraft in Snow White, Beauty and the Beast, Little Mermaid, Brave, Frozen? They don't think depiction of magic is inappropriate for children. They think depiction of Asian spiritual practices are inappropriate for children. And I know it is precisely the function of racism to distract you. To throw all these bogus at you, to distract and exhaust you so you can't have the conversation that you want to be having. In the words of Toni Morrison, the very serious function of racism is distraction. It keeps you from doing your work. It keeps you explaining over and over again your reason for being. None of this is necessary. There will always be one more thing. So, in this video, I'm not going to be talking about whether or not turning red is appropriate for children, if it's relatable, if it's demonic, or if the story starring a Chinese-Canadian girl is for the general public. These are distractions. Besides, other people have already talked about these themes in more depth. So I'm going to do my work and talk about what I think is an important conversation to have. So first, disclaimers. When the first trailer for Turning Red was released, seeing it, I admittedly felt a lot of apprehension. Not because of the material of the trailer or the movie itself, though there are discussions to be had about that, including the use of beatboxing, stereotypical sassy hand-head movements, specific dance moves that are derivative imitations or directly taken from black cultures without the participation and attribution to black communities. That is a much-needed conversation to be had about cross-cultural influences, appropriation and misappropriation among and within BIPOC communities. But that's a different conversation, and it deserves its own space, and not the one that I will be going into right now. I'm also not going to get too hung up on whether or not the representation of Chinese culture is authentic in Turning Red. Even though I did have some hesitation, and we did end up with this Screen Rant article, which implies that some people were wondering if mythical red panda powers were the real Chinese thing. But overall, after seeing the movie, I think it manages well in balancing the blend of the creator's own original fantasy and elements from actual Chinese and Chinese-Canadian culture. I'm not actually going to be talking about Turning Red that much at all. I'm going to focus on the fact that I am wary of Western media monopolizing the portrayal of Asian experience and even Asian culture. Chapter 1. Whose Asian Immigrant Story? Sometimes I feel a disconnect in the discussion of Asian representation or representation of Asian immigrant experience. To me, there is a part of the conversation missing, or a group missing from the conversation. Because Asian immigrants are in Asian countries too. Some people, many people, have dual citizenships. Some people go back and forth. Some people move back to their home countries permanently after a while. There is no rule saying that Asian diaspora experience in Western countries can only be represented in Western media. Nevertheless, when people in Western countries talk about the Asian diaspora or Asian immigrant representations in media, they're almost exclusively talking about it in Western media. Now, I want to acknowledge that part of this is due to the anxiety of the perpetual foreigner status that follows Asian people living in predominantly white countries. Part of the discrimination and alienation that Asian people face is that they are underrepresented and often excluded from the media produced by societies which they are a part of. There is a real and true need to see more Asian people in Western media. There are Asian Americans, Asian Canadians, Asian Australians, etc., in stories that are not always about immigration. Actually, Turning Red isn't a story about immigration, even though there are elements of it that invoke the experience of immigration. More specifically, there are elements that invoke the Asian diaspora experience. Although I don't think the general audience really differentiates that much between the immigrant experience and diaspora experience. The general white audience probably sees anything Asian as inherently foreign and a transplant. And that is part of the problem or the conundrum, one that Asian people in the US, Canada are still working on challenging. I want to acknowledge that particular and justified problem and need. Then I want to focus on the specific discussion of Asian immigration in media, and the fact that people have been telling stories about the immigrant experience in Asian cinema for a long time. There are a multitude, a variety, a diversity of perspectives on this subject outside of the Western lands. I'm focusing mainly on East Asian productions here because that's what I'm familiar with and have the most access to. This is by no means an exhaustive list, and there are many more, but you got my point, hopefully. These stories deal with the duality of being an Asian immigrant. Some of them are funny, some of them are dramatic, some deal with elder immigrants, and some, yes, are coming-of-age stories. I want these Asian stories and their perspectives to exist in a pantheon of Asian stories and perspectives. And I want resources and recognitions to be distributed across these stories. I would love that. What I don't love is the monopoly and a certain essentializing of Asian and Asian diaspora experience by virtue of Hollywood and companies like Disney and Pixar having a strong chokehold on mainstream culture. And it clearly has a line of story that it favors when it comes to immigration. So often, when I look at the mainstream portrayal of East Asian immigrants, it tells the same story. A young immigrant person, most likely second or third generation, living with hyphenated identity stuck between the traditional family-oriented Asian values and the progressive, individualistic Western lifestyles. A catalyst appears, and they must choose between two competing identities, ultimately, usually, finding some kind of balance and coming to claim their dual hyphenated identity. There is fundamentally nothing wrong with that. Let's make this very clear. There is nothing wrong with this narrative in and of itself about Asian immigrants claiming their identity as Asian Americans, Canadians, British, Australians, through the struggle of bridging and straddling two cultures that are seen as in conflict with each other. However, I argue that it is a specific struggle and portrayed with a particular solution. There are different ways people relate to the immigrant experience that don't tend to get depicted in mainstream media, such as the transracial international adoptee experience, or any in-depth portrayal of the relationship between Asian immigrants and other communities of color, particularly Black and Latin cultures, in shared spaces. We also seldom see immigrant families where one of the parents stay in their home country, working there to support their family's education and living expense overseas, despite this being a not uncommon arrangement for many immigrant families. But these experiences and themes are relegated to the periphery, because the mainstream media is far more interested in interrogating the relationship of the Asian diaspora with the dominant culture in terms of identity. And if I want to be more pointed and more damning, I might say that it feels like it's the only kind of Asian story that's deemed to have a quote-unquote broad appeal. Chapter 2. The Hollywood Monopoly. Notice how I've only talked about Asian immigrant experience in Western countries, specifically English-speaking, predominantly white countries. This is not by accident. The world is dominated by white culture and English as a language, and Hollywood is the indisputable hub of cultural output for the English-speaking West. So, it is no surprise that media produced in and by Hollywood centers on the Western and English-speaking experience, including when it's about the immigrant experience, which could be from and in anywhere. Now, some might say, what's the problem? Of course, Western English media is going to focus on Western English-speaking experience and stories because that is its primary workforce and audience. Isn't it unreasonable to demand or critique representation about, say, Korean Colombians from Disney? Well, I have two main responses to this. First, Hollywood produces global exports. Pixar, Disney, DreamWorks, etc. are global enterprises that once again dominate the entertainment market. They don't just produce media for the American or even just Western audience. They produce media with the ambition of exporting it to as many countries as possible, to every corner of the world if they could help it. So much so that they'll ditch their pretend progressivism whenever it comes to trying to sell their products to the Chinese market, whether it's censoring LGBT presence or ignoring literal human rights violation. Second, companies like Disney, Pixar willingly engages in the portrayal of cultures outside of the English-speaking West all the time, and it's only recently that they started being not terrible. Earlier, I mentioned Korean Colombians on purpose because Disney's latest animated movie was Encanto, which is about a Colombian family set in Colombia. Now, Encanto is a charming movie with catchy songs. How it portrays Colombia connects with Colombians around the world, or how it interacts with Colombian or Latin American native movie and animation industry, I can't say, and I'm not qualified to have an opinion. But I do know this, that Disney's animated Mulan grossed over $300 million in 1998's money, which would be over $520 million today. And Zhang Ziya, a 2020 Chinese animated movie also about a Chinese legendary folk hero, grossed only around $242 million in today's money. This is especially insidious when Hollywood products about Asian culture are then sold back to Asian countries. I watched Disney's 1998 Mulan before I learned about the actual poem in school. This was one of my main apprehensions when I first learned that Pixar was making an animated film about a Chinese-Canadian girl who turns into a red panda set in the early 2000s. Not because I don't want a story with Chinese-Canadian characters, but that I knew it was going to be a particular portrayal of East Asian culture and Asian immigrant experience in the West. Chapter 3. Addressing Generational Trauma. A lot of people are saying that Disney is starting a new era of telling multi-generational stories about communities of color navigating generational trauma, especially with an emphasis on healing and moving forward in the second or younger generation. You have Encanto, you have Coco, you have Turning Red, which, cool. There are different critiques about this, such as why is it that in these stories the responsibility always falls on the matriarch? How do these depictions of generational trauma sanitize and shift the responsibility of reconciliation onto the individual or family unit, while the larger political institutional perpetrators remain mostly absent and unaccountable? Whether or not these movies paint an unrealistic picture of cross-generational relationship when second-generation immigrants feel like the older generation in their lives are still unwilling to change or apologize for their role in perpetuating the trauma. I'm not going to get into all of that, especially not the last part, because I don't feel particularly connected to that conversation. What I do want to point out is that this conversation is only happening, that it is only able to happen because there is a perception or a lived experience in which the trauma is in the past. That the scarring colonial, geopolitical, familial trauma was experienced and belonged to the last generation. That they are passing it down, second-handed, to the younger generation. This is just not true for many, or even the majority of people. For many East Asian peoples in Asia, a lot of the themes and struggles depicted in these last-generation immigrants' past are an ongoing experience. 2019 South Korean film Parasite. It could very much be a story of generational trauma. A story about dealing with poverty, class inequality, the inability to break out of the cycle in a capitalist society, and what that does to families and parent-child relationships, depicted rightfully and accurately as an ongoing thing. And that is often the other side of the immigrant story. Even in Parasite, which is set in and never leaves South Korea, the sister gets himself hired as the English tutor for the rich family by pretending to be a returning foreign student. That is the dynamic at play in many East Asian countries when we talk about immigration. That those who can afford to study, to work, or to immigrate overseas are perceived as more prestigious, given more opportunities, and often do come from families and backgrounds with more resources and robust support network. So, when movies such as Crazy Rich Asians seems to problematize and grapple with the disconnection Chinese Americans feel from Chinese culture, what I'm thinking about is, who gets to leave in the first place? What of the people who stayed? And do their stories get celebrated and spotlighted? I don't say this to invalidate or dismiss the experience of Asian Americans in their struggle to connect with Asian cultures as a minority in a predominantly white society. It is an experience that's deeply felt and clearly resonated with many Asian people in diaspora. I only mean to point out that there's a whole other side to this picture that doesn't get nearly as much attention in the mainstream. Chapter 4. The Representation Politics as Creating Hegemony. Corporations like Disney and Pixar control the market globally. They have a large hand in siphoning resources, making it difficult for Asian creators to tell our stories, and then exporting their products into the Asian market with all of its advertising and marketing power, further marginalizing native and independent filmmakers and their outputs. That is an issue, especially as I pointed out earlier that Hollywood does try to do the representation thing with other cultures. And as Accented Cinema in his video, Why China Cares About Kung Fu Panda says, is Kung Fu Panda an accurate representation of Chinese culture? No, it isn't. But that doesn't matter. If it is the only good Chinese movie about Chinese culture, it wins by default. Yang makes this point to talk about the stagnation of Chinese cinema in the past decades, which is a relevant critique in its own dimension. However, I would also like to posit that the burden is not solely on Chinese or Asian filmmakers in general, but that there is a lack of curiosity or lack of appetite on the part of the audience to explore Asian films. The industry and culture globally overlooks, discourages, and sometimes actively put down media that deviates from the Western mainstream. The fact that there was so much controversy over Parasite winning the Oscar was itself a reflection of this climate. I myself hold no reverence for the Oscar, To me, it seems clear that it's an incessantly white institution that continues to disparage, disregard, disrespect, and harm artists of color, no matter how intentionally it tries to project a progressive, liberal image of prestige. However, it remains a fact that the Oscar is the most widely known and visible stage for movies and cinematic arts to be recognized. And it is emblematic and telling that this stage and its audience have such a strong inclination to exclude narratives that's outside of a mainstream Western lens. In conclusion, the answer I want to all of this, of course, is not for there to not have stories about Asian immigrants in Western countries having these specific relationships with their Asian identity. It's not even for there to be less of it. I'm not boycotting Disney and Pixar for them to stop telling these stories. Nor do I want these Western entertainment giants to take up the mantle of telling these stories from other perspectives. Like, God, please. I cannot stress how much I desperately do not want Disney to try to tell a story about a Fujianese country girl moving to Beijing and her struggle to adapt to big city life with her magical psychic monkey or something. What I want is for artists, creators, and storytellers outside of the Western English-speaking world, outside of Hollywood, to be given the resources to tell their stories from their chosen perspectives, and for their artistry and cultural output to be appreciated and rewarded. I want people to watch Zhang Ziya and watch Kung Fu Panda, to watch Soul Searching and watch Minari, watch Crazy Rich Asians and watch American Girl. And I want people to look at and appreciate stories about immigration that is not produced by Disney or Pixar. They may come from a perspective or have a conclusion that is unfamiliar or even uncomfortable for them. And I want people to ask this question: why are there so many Asian people migrating in the first place? Because mainstream American studios sure are not going to produce anything that seriously interrogate the historical and geopolitical context behind immigration, are they? Anyway, that's all I have to say for now. There are more I want to say, things I would like to get into more, but if I let this get too long, I won't ever actually record it. Even right now, I'm still a little unsure whether or not I want to put this out into the world. I repeated several times in this video that essentially my point isn't to dunk on movies like Turning Red, or say that they shouldn't exist, or to put the burden on Asian creators in Hollywood to tell different stories, when there is a larger structural condition that makes things the way they are. I hope that was clear in what I said, but I kept repeating myself because I just had this feeling that some people might misconstrue it, either intentionally or as a knee-jerk reaction. That feels like part of the problem as well. That when it comes to Asian stories or any marginalized story really, it often feels like competing for such limited spotlight. And people are being pitted against each other for that spotlight. I had this fear that by saying we should pay more attention to stories and films like American Girl or the story of returning adoptees in South Korean media, I would be perpetuating the idea that Asians belong in Asia. Or I would be undermining the celebration of, say, Chinese Canadians feeling connected and whole in their Chinese Canadianness. I don't want to feed into those unproductive narratives. What I want is for us to interrogate why the spotlight is so narrow, that we seem only able to have one story at a time, and how damaging that is. Both the Southeast Asian representation video and the Blackness in Disney movies video by Princess Weeks touched on this, or I think they do. That we put so much stock into these corporations representing our cultures because they have such a strong chokehold on the culture, not just in North America, but globally. That when they make something about us, we know it's gonna be blasted to every corner of the world, and it's going to dominate the conversation for literally an entire generation. And that to me is a much bigger problem than what each of these individual Hollywood films does in terms of representation. I guess that's what I want to be saying ultimately.